Hello. Let's discuss a basic feature of cells, and that's the size that they have. What could you say in general? Well, you'd be safe if you said cells are small. I know that sounds sort of obvious, but think about it for a moment. You might want to ask the question, why do cells need to be small? And so that's what we're going to be interested in talking about is, what are some of the conditions a cell has to deal with? What are some of the features of a cell that are necessary for a cell to be an efficient, functioning unit? Remember, the cell is going to be carrying out all kinds of chemical reactions. It's going to be taking in nutrients. It's going to be getting rid of waste materials. It's going to be interacting with other cells. It has to have a number of specialized characteristics, and they tend to be small. So we want to investigate why that might be the case. Well, cell size is determined by a number of features, but you might think of it as two basic characteristics. What's the cell doing? What's its job? Because in many cases, cells need to have specific shapes associated with a specific kind of job they do. And also, then, we have to think about, what about the surface to volume ratio limitations? And you say, well, I've never heard of that before. Well, that's something we're going to develop. We're going to talk about that idea. But let me give it to you in a general sense first. The surface is the membrane of the cell, that portion of the cell that interacts with the environment. Think about what has to go on at that level of the cell. Materials have to get into the cell. Materials have to get out of the cell. If the cell is going to interact with its environment or interact with other cells, it's going to be through that membrane. So there's going to be some important characteristics I have to consider associated with the surface of the cell. And one of them is simply, how big is the surface? How broad is that surface compared to the amount of, think of it as fluid that I'm holding inside of that membrane. All right, that would be the volume component. So my surface to volume ratio, you're going to find, becomes very important. And just to give you sort of a little hint, what you want to be thinking about is that I want to have a high amount of surface compared to a relatively low amount of volume, and I will be most efficient. All right, well, let's take a look at some examples of the kinds of cell functions and sizes that we see. All right, so what determines the size of it? Its location, its function, and that quality that we mentioned of surface to volume ratio. Cells might be very, very large and have large amounts of material included in them, like an oocyte, an ova, an egg cell. Well, those kinds of cells are produced by a variety of different organisms, and interestingly enough, the cells don't remain in that size or in that spherical shape for very long. One reason: large size, low surface to volume ratio. Spherical shape, low surface to volume ratio. But notice, I still produce this very large cell for a brief period of time because it has a particular function, and that function is going to be important for some type of reproductive process. I can't maintain the cell in that specialized form for a long period of time, though. What about things like neurons, nerve cells? Long, thin, thread-like kinds of cells. Well, I can think of particular neurons that are as long as my leg. Portions of them extend from my spinal cord the whole way down to the tip of my toe. Very, very long cells. Well, sounds like I'm talking about very big cells. But notice I keep coming back to that idea of surface to volume ratio. And so, if I'm going to have a cell that's very, very long, guess what else it has to be? Extremely thin. What does that do? By having a very thin cell, I'm going to have still a very high surface to volume ratio. And if you've ever seen pictures of neurons, or you might want to search for a picture of one, you'll notice that they're flattened, they have lots of branches. In other words, they're a very thin cell, even though they might be extremely long. What seems to be the reason for being so thin? Well, it seems to solve the surface to volume ratio problem. Remember, I want to have a high surface to volume ratio. Well, there's also cells that are cylindrical, like the muscle cells in your muscles, and they have the capacity to contract and relax. These are specialized cells. We might think of them in general as being muscle cells or myocytes, and their shape and form is directly determined by What? Well, the function that they're doing, the location that they're found. And as a way to maximize their surface to volume ratio, when you have a chance to study myocytes, you're going to find that their cell surface has long extensions that stick down into the interior of the cell, so that the surface membrane of the cell is very, very large. And I still have a cell that has a high surface to volume ratio, even though it has this long sort of cylindrical kind of shape, specialized for its function. Now, cells might be semi-spherical, something like an erythrocyte, a red blood cell. If I look at it from one direction, it looks like a perfectly round cell. But when I tip it on its edge, what I find is that it's really sort of shaped like a donut. It's flattened from side to side. So when I see cells that have this spherical or semi-spherical quality, I'm going to expect to find that those cells either don't exist for a very long period of time, remember what you mentioned about the ovum, or that they're going to be modified in some way so that they're not completely spherical. They're only spherical in one direction, so to speak, a donut kind of shape. So I need that specialized shape to function well as an oxygen-carrying cell, but I still have to be able to solve that surface to volume ratio problem. So I've been mentioning it for every one of these things. Let's take a look at what we mean by this surface to volume ratio. We're talking about a fraction, and we're talking about, in a very crude sense, we just measure how much surface there is, how many units of surface, and we divide by how many units of volume it's containing. Well, what do I want to have? Remember, my goal is to have a high surface to volume ratio. So one of the ways to do that is to not be a large cell. Large cells, right, have low surface to volume ratio. Remember those large cells I mentioned to you previously? They were cells that either were large only for a short period of time, or they had some kind of specialization that increased their surface relative to the amount of volume that they had. Smaller cells seem to be the solution if I want to have a high surface to volume ratio. And also, remember I mentioned that not only do I want to be small, but I want to try to avoid being spherical. Why? Because a sphere, a ball, has the lowest surface to volume ratio of any shape, of any container. So what are my goals? High surface to volume ratio, try not to be spherical, or if I am, only for a short period of time, and if possible, be as small as I can be. All right, so we're going to see that pattern when we look at different kinds of living things. Bacteria, the individual cells of your body, we're going to find that the tendency is toward small size. Let's take a look and see what that might mean. Notice what we have here. This is an image that you'll find in your textbook. Take a look at this. See what I have here? I have two different ways of dividing up the same amount of volume. All right? Notice that in both of these cases, I have on one side a 30 by 30 single large cell, and on the other side, I have a series of cells that are 1/3 that overall size. And so I have a whole large number of individual small cells. As I look at those two illustrations, I think to myself, well, if the key thing I want to be able to do is get materials into and out of that fluid that's contained within the membrane, that cytoplasm of the cell, then it's going to be much more efficient with multiple surface areas that I see over here, right? And every one of those little boxes has all of the surfaces that can allow materials to move in and out. It's going to be much more efficient than having just one large volume. Now, what I can do is you can actually figure out the math of this, and you can figure out their volumes, right? They both have the same volume of material contained either inside of one large container or in a large number of small containers. And you can see that with the large cell, I have a particular surface area. How much surface is there? And small cells, add up all their surfaces. That's how much surface there is. divide surface by volume, and you can see I get a ratio. For a whole bunch of small cells dividing up a particular volume, in this case, a surface to volume ratio of 0.6. For one large cell, surface to volume ratio of 0.2. 3 times better. You could think of it that way. Well, that means that this is one way to attain that high surface to volume ratio, is be small. All right, now there are limits. Matter of fact, we don't really know how small something can be and still be a cell. And you might find interesting doing a search on the web for what are called nano bacteria, because some people argue that they're the smallest individual cells. There's some dispute, but I think you'll find it interesting if you do a quick search for those. They seem to have pushed the extreme of small size. Now here's another way you can visualize it. Basically the same idea, but notice that here we're comparing, and if you look at this table you can see that we have just one block, one cell, all right, with a particular surface area, and a unit of volume. Notice this is a unitless illustration, 1 unit of volume, and the surface to volume ratio is 6. Well, now what if I have a volume that's 125 times that, and I contain that volume inside one big cell versus a large number of smaller cells? Well, you can see what happens. Same volume, much different surface areas. Surface to volume ratio in the case of the big cell versus the small cell. We have the best situation when we have the volume subdivided by a large number of small cells. All right, so let's recap. We expect to find cells coming in a wide variety of forms, but what happens is that one of the features we expect to see, regardless of the variety of form, different forms, different functions, different locations where they're being used, but one of the things we expect to find that's going to be relatively consistent is that the cell is going to have found some way to solve the surface to volume ratio problem. They want to have a high surface to volume ratio, right? So, how do I do that? Be small. Be long and thin. Have increased size to my membrane. Alter the basic spherical shape of a cell. Or, if I am going to be large and spherical, only remain that way for a short period of time. Notice what the central idea was. Cells seem to be trying to maximize their surface to volume ratio. Thanks very much. I look forward to talking to you about cells in more detail later.